Welcome back, everyone. Well, I have been getting literally hundreds of messages on X, on Instagram, here on YouTube, all saying the same thing. When are you going to address the fact that they've identified Jack the Ripper? It's confirmed. They know it was him. It was Aaron Kosminski. Chris, you were right all along when you said that you thought it was Kosminski, but I always said I didn't think it was Aaron Kosminski, but somebody else with that name. Anyway, anytime I post anything, I post a picture of my son and I at a soccer game in England, and people reply with, Kosminski, when are you going to talk about it? So I'm going to talk about it. Here we go. Let's talk about it. Have they identified Jack the Ripper? Finally. Is it finally solved? This mystery that goes back 30 years for me and goes back 140 years for the world. The short answer, no. I'm going to dive into this a little bit, and I want to talk about why it's really important for us to look at more than the headlines, because what do all the headlines say? Well, let's take a look at some of the headlines. All right, so here's just a few of them. This is from an Australian news source. We may finally know the true identity of Jack the Ripper after 137 years of mystery. This is the New York Post. Jack the Ripper's identity revealed after DNA breakthrough, historian says. All right, this is People. Jack the Ripper researcher who claims to have identified the serial killer with 100% DNA match seeks closure. Science.org does a new genetic analysis finally reveal the identity of Jack the Ripper. Newsweek, who was Aaron Kosminski? Historian claims DNA identifies Jack the Ripper. So all of them have that kind of similar feel when you see the headlines, and a lot of people are taking these stories and then they're reposting them, saying things like Jack the Ripper identified 100%. But when you start looking at the headlines and then reading into the article, you find that they're all the exact same story. And what is that story? Well, a historian, a guy who has a previous history of falsely claiming to have evidence that shows a breakthrough in a case. There was a case from murders in the 1960s in the UK where he claimed he found the top of the skull of the one missing victim from that case. And it turned out he hadn't, and he made the whole thing up. So there's a history here, first of all. So let's lay that out. Second of all, when you look at all of these stories, they all point back to a 2019 DNA test. That was 5 years ago, that we have been hearing about for years. So what has changed? Well, all of a sudden, I think he's got a book that he's selling. And so all of a sudden, he is reporting this story. And all of these stories, all of these headlines that say Jack the Ripper identified, they go back to the exact same source. And it's this author, Russell Edwards. Every single one of these is just Russell Edwards saying that the DNA has proven it. Have we seen the results of the DNA test? No, we haven't. We just have his word for it that the results prove that. And what's the DNA test? Let's talk about it for a minute. Well, back in 2007, there was a shawl that went up for auction. And it was said that it was recovered at the site of the murder of Catherine Eddowes, who was one of the two double event victims, we call it. If you're not familiar with Jack the Ripper, I would suggest you watch my reaction to the Lamino fantastic documentary on Jack the Ripper. I think the best documentary that's ever been done. And there are what we call 5 canonical victims, the ones that most historians believe are the 5 we can say for sure were killed by the killer that we have dubbed Jack the Ripper. There may have been more. Some argue that maybe they're not all him, but generally that's the 5. So it's Polly Nichols, Mary Chapman, or Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, Elizabeth Stride, and Mary Jane Kelly. Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride were killed the same night, not real far apart from each other. One was not mutilated like the others because he was interrupted in the middle of doing it, and they believe that's why he went then and killed someone else. So Catherine Eddowes, this shawl is found. And so the story goes that Russell Edwards buys this shawl in 2007. He has DNA work done on it. And based on comparing the DNA that was found on this shawl to descendants, because several of Jack the Ripper's victims, including relatives of Catherine Eddowes, several Jack the Ripper's victims had children, and they have living descendants today. And so they compared the DNA to a descendant of Catherine Eddowes, and they compared DNA, male DNA that was found on it, to relatives of Aaron Kosminski, and they say that both were 100% match. So let's read some of these stories and get a little deeper into what it talks about here. Okay, so this story here, this is the one on New York Post. English historian and author Russell Edwards said DNA found on a shawl recovered from the scene of one of the killer's vicious slayings was tested, revealing the butcher who terrorized Victorian London's East End in the late 1800s was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski, who died in a mental institution in 1919. He says, when we matched the DNA from the blood on the shawl with a direct female descendant of the victim, it was the singular most amazing moment of my life at the time. Okay. We tested semen left on the shawl. When we matched that, I was dumbfounded. We actually had discovered who Jack the Ripper truly was. What does it say? After learning the shawl had been found at the scene of Eddowes' killing, he purchased it in 2007. Relatives of 5 known victims have pushed Scotland Yard to take a fresh look at the 137-year-old case. Tells a little more about this. It says here, several online skeptics have questioned Edwards' findings, however, pointing to allegations he faked finding the top of a child's skull in 2022, sparking a new police search for the body of Keith Bennett. So right there, that should tell you a little something. This is a guy who has a past history of getting involved in high-profile cases, claiming he's got new evidence that nobody else could find, and then it turned out to be nothing. Okay, this is the story from People. Edwards claims that Aaron Kosminski is the Ripper based on what he said is a 100% match with DNA found on the attire piece. Kosminski was a suspect in the original investigation, and that's absolutely true. But again, all of this is based on Edwards claiming that this happened. None of this says, here's the actual test that was done, here's the markers that were identified, here's the percentage match, here are the odds. Because I could do a DNA test based on certain markers and say it's 100% match. But it could be 100% match to 3 million people. That doesn't prove anything. I need to know what the odds are that it's somebody other than Kosminski that matches this. And we're not getting that. The historian allegedly confirmed that Kosminski's DNA was on Eddowes' shawl with the help of Dr. Jari, and I'm not going to read that last name, a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University who isolated small segments of DNA from bloodstains on the garment. The segments were then matched with a direct descendant of Eddowes, while DNA from the semen stains on the shawl was a match to a descendant of Kosminski. Some people doubt Edwards' findings, as the DNA evidence integral to his claim has not been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. In other words, I've got the proof we did the DNA test, but I'm not going to show you the test we did or the results. You're just going to have to take my word for it that we found Jack the Ripper. Please buy my book. Along with 10 descendants of Eddowes who all want closure. Part of this closure, the historian said, will come from seeing Kosminski's name linked to the murders. Okay, so now let's go to science.org and see what they say. This isn't the first time that Kosminski has been linked to the crimes, but it is the first time that supporting DNA evidence has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, so they're saying it's been published now in a journal. What is the evidence? The first genetic tests on shawl samples were conducted several years ago by that same scientist, but he said he wanted to wait for the fuss to die down before he submitted the results. Seems a little fishy to me. Author Russell Edwards, who bought the shawl in 2007 and gave it to that scientist, used the unpublished results of the test to identify Kosminski as the murderer in his 2014 book called Naming Jack the Ripper. But geneticists complained at the time it was impossible to assess the claims because few technical details about the analysis of the genetic samples from the shawl were available. So what they're saying now, what has changed, is that the scientist is submitting this evidence. So the new paper lays those out up to a point. What he and his colleague David Miller, the reproduction and sperm expert at the University of Leeds, claim is, quote, the most systematic and most advanced genetic analysis to date regarding the Jack the Ripper murders. They describe extracting and amplifying the DNA from the shawl. The tests compared fragments of mitochondrial DNA, the portion of DNA inherited from one's mother. So that's your mitochondrial DNA. This is the same kind of DNA they used to identify Richard III after they found his skeleton underneath a parking lot. It gets passed down through the female line. So my mother and her mother and her mother would have the same mitochondrial DNA as my mother's sister's children would have, etc. That kind of thing. So through an unbroken female line, it can go to a male, but I would not pass that mitochondrial DNA down to my children. My children will only get mitochondrial DNA from their mother. So the DNA matches of that of a living relative of Kosminski, they conclude in the Journal of Forensic Scientists. The analysis also suggests the killer had brown hair and brown eyes. That doesn't mean a whole lot. My DNA says that I have light hair. Do I look like I have light hair to you? But that's what my DNA says. So it's still kind of an unproven science, the whole DNA tells what hair color you have thing. Now, let's go on. The results are unlikely to satisfy critics. Key details of the specific genetic variants identified and compared between DNA samples are not included in the paper. And this is my issue with this. Until we see that and we know exactly what DNA has been sequenced, we don't know. They haven't even given us the percentages. Like if they could even tell us, these DNA tests say that it's a 1 in a billion chance that it's anybody but Aaron Kosminski, then we have something. Or that Aaron Kosminski is one of like 1 in 10 million that could have done that. That would be significant to me. But the fact they're not doing that tells me a lot. Because if I said earlier, if I only analyze certain genetic markers, that can be a very broad number of matches. It could be something that 1 in 5 people on the planet matches based on how you analyze it. So you could say, hey, we did the test on a shawl we believe came from Catherine Eddowes, and there's only a 1 in 5 chance that, like only 1 in 5 people carry this marker, and Aaron Kosminski happens to carry this marker. Okay, that narrows it down, but that does not definitively identify Jack the Ripper. The authors say in their paper that the Data Protection Act, a UK law designed to protect the privacy of individuals, stops them from publishing the genetic sequences of the living relatives of Eddowes and Kosminski. That's true, but you can still give us the data. You can still say this narrows it down to such a percentage. And the fact that they're not doing that tells me that they're hiding something, tells me that this is just about sensationalism and it doesn't prove anything at all. So here you go. Walter Parson, a forensic scientist at the Institute of Legal Medicine at Innsbruck Medical University, says mitochondrial DNA sequences pose no risk to privacy, and the authors should have included them in the paper. Otherwise, the reader cannot judge the result. I wonder where science and research are going when we start to avoid showing results, but instead present colored boxes. I agree 1,000%. They're hiding something, or they would prove this. There's no reason not to show this. So another expert says that it can only show that people or two DNA samples are not related. Based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. In other words, the DNA from the shawl could be from Kosminski, but it could also come from thousands of people who lived in London at the time. That's my issue. We haven't proven anything. And the last point from this particular article that I think is really interesting is that this is not the first time that people have claimed that DNA proved who Jack the Ripper was. When Patricia Cornwell wrote her book, where she said that she had definitively identified Jack the Ripper as the painter Walter Sickert, they looked at DNA on letters that may or may not have come from the killer and said that that DNA proved that Walter Sickert was the killer. It didn't prove anything. So this article here gives us a little more details about who specifically was tested. So Karen Miller is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Catherine Eddowes, and she's the one who provided the DNA. And assuming then that Karen Miller is through an unbroken female line, then that would be a source for mitochondrial DNA. And that, again, all begs the question, where's the shawl been from 1888 to 2007? Do we have any kind of chain of custody? Like, do we know where it's been all that time that we can even prove definitively that it came from Catherine Eddowes in the first place? There's no way if we're talking about a court proceeding, that would ever be evidence that would be allowed in court. They would argue that chain of custody was broken, and that could be anybody's DNA on that shawl. That's obviously a technical aspect to all of this, but that's something we have to think about too. Okay, and the last thing I want to look at here is this is actually from Ashley Banfield was on with a criminal defense attorney and a DNA expert named Jarrett Ambo, and he addresses the problems with this particular DNA test and why it's questionable at best. Listen to what he has to say.
The DNA used here is what's called mitochondrial DNA. It's a much smaller strand than the regular nuclear DNA we use to identify people. And as such, just right off the bat, it doesn't have the kind of power to identify someone individually that nuclear DNA has, or cellular DNA. This is DNA from a small organelle that's inside the cell, and the DNA strand is much, much smaller. We have the second problem of the fact that this DNA is degraded over years, right? DNA degrades in the environment when it interacts with oxygen, sunlight, heat. And so the strands of DNA that were measured in this particular case, they'd never been measured before in this manner. So they were very small strands, about 100 base pairs, compared to millions and millions and millions of base pairs normally. And so hundreds of base pairs long. And having not ever been compared before, there's no real statistical analysis on how rare they are, how much they occur in everyone's mitochondrial DNA, or everyone in that area in England and London. And so finding a few matches on a few of these sites, and in fact, in this particular case, 7 out of 9 sites, gives you some information, but it's not nearly enough information to say with any kind of certainty that this is the man that is Jack the Ripper. I mean, it is a mile from saying anything like that.
So there you go. Basically what we have is finally the results have been presented to the world, but still the details, the real details are being withheld. And what we have is a shawl that could have come from the killer, or from the site of one of the murders and have the DNA of the victim and the killer on it. It could. And we have 2 DNA matches to a descendant of Eddowes and to a relative of Aaron Kosminski. But those DNA matches could be 1 in 2. So maybe half the population matches in that way. It could be 1 in 10. It could be 1 in 50. But either way, it's not 1 in millions or 1 in billions the way we would need to definitively say it has to be this person. The bottom line, Jack the Ripper has not been identified and unfortunately probably never will be. If you want to learn more, though, about the Jack the Ripper case, I took a look at Lamino and his fantastic documentary on this subject, and I'll throw the link here up on the screen as well as down in the description. Check that out if you want to learn all the details about this case. I am heading back to London in just a couple of weeks where I'm going to be doing my own original content related to this, but instead of telling the story of the murders, I want to take a deeper dive into the story of these women, of these 5 canonical victims, and tell their stories, not just of how they died, but of what their lives were like and what led them to that place and time and to the fate that they've suffered. Thanks for watching.